Thank you so much, Dad. And hi, Jimmy. Thank you for inviting me. It's always fun. I'm always happy to talk about Homul and my archaeology. And so I have a few slides I want to show you about the things that we found at Homul and why I think it's such a fascinating site. And let me see if I can share my screen real quick. So you saw in the documentary overlaps with my presentation. I'll have some slides about the new maps that we made at the end, but here I just want to talk about the site itself and how it helped us understand Maya history, Maya civilization a little bit better in the last 5 years, really. Homul, when I started working there 20 years ago, was largely unknown. We certainly didn't know it had any kings or was really part of this grand history written in stone that we know from places like Tikal or Tsibanche or Calakmul. And over the years, we have been uncovering lots of inscriptions that actually open up a new window into my history, which was something I did not expect when I started working here. And in addition to that, there's beautiful art that it was perfectly preserved. It's still buried, but I fixed our excavation tunnels in a way we can bring a few people in there at a time to see this fantastic product of Maya artistry. So Holmul, as Ted was saying, is one of the more remote sites in the Maya lowlands. It's up in the northeast, to the east of Tikal, and near the border with Belize. And in this map here, you see some of the big players in Maya history, places like Tikal, El Sots, Calakmul, which was the capital of the famous Snake Kingdom that at one time defeated Tikal and, as we know now, actually conquered many of the other Maya kingdoms. Of course, when I started working at Holmul, we didn't know any of this 20 years ago. But that's why my archaeology is so exciting, because every year we find something that changes our understanding and enriches our understanding of Maya history. And so Holmul actually does have a part to play in this, in Maya history, as we know now. It's not one of the largest cities. It's probably one of the secondary kingdoms in the Maya world, but because of its location and because it was such a long occupied city, it actually figures in Maya history quite prominently. I was surprised. This is a reconstruction of what Homul may have looked like about 1,000 years ago, before it was completely abandoned for unknown reasons. And we still don't know why people left, but they did. The city itself would have been filled with houses surrounding these paved plazas. And this reconstruction was done by an architect based on the maps that we had at the time. And so he put the houses where we have located houses. Of course, now we know that there were way more houses and there were much fewer vegetation, trees, and there was very little forest around Holmul at the time, as a true city, surrounded by jungle, but far in the distance. The two main pyramids are the ones that we've investigated more recently. In 20 years, we excavated in different parts of the site and in the periphery. We found other sites around Homul, so we could understand it from its context a little better. And I want to show you what we found in these two pyramids. There are things that you can see when you visit the site. The site is, as I said, is not easy to get to, so we have very few visitors every year. Literally, maybe 3 or 4 groups every year of maybe 5 to 10 people. So this is one of the structures that you can see at the site. This was a recent photo. The site looks a lot like it has not been investigated for 20 years, and I said it with a little bit of pride. because part of its magic is the jungle that still covers the ruins. And I like to present it as I first saw it when I was still a student. And I thought maybe I wanted to do a project here. And it's really unusual in that sense because there's still a lot of architecture that is standing as if the Maya just left a few years ago. Here you have this black painted doorway that leads into a long hallway into this mound that actually was a pyramid that was never finished. And inside that unfinished pyramid, there is a tomb. And below the tomb, there is another pyramid that I'll show you in a minute. And it was quite fantastic how many things we found inside this. It just looks like a ruined structure. Here's an overlay of what we found behind the doorway inside that pile of rocks. So very well preserved buildings and even some tombs, the tombs of the kings of the dynasty. I didn't even know they had a dynasty until I found this. This is this amazing carved and painted decoration on the rooftop of an earlier structure that was buried by the last pyramid. We found this in 2013. We spent many years doing conservation on it. And it's a beautiful work of art, but it's also an incredible page in Maya history. Because in addition to all these elaborate carved figures that you see in the photo, there's a long inscription at the bottom that tells us about the dynasty. And as I said, we didn't know anything about any dynasty from Homul prior to this. And it tells us about their political affiliations as well. So it was just amazing. Here's a general view of the whole carving. It's 8 meters long, goes from corner to corner over on the roof of this temple. Very much like the temples that you see at Tikal, they have these very elaborate carved roof structures. Although at Tikal they've been all destroyed by the environment over the last 1,000 years. But here we have a view of what those temples must have looked like if it had been covered up by the Maya. And clearly this is not the only one that we have found in Maya archaeology. There are other examples of structures like this that were buried and they reveal their beautiful art. This is perhaps just one of the better preserved ones. So in the middle, you see the image of a king seated with his big feather headdress on top of this monstrous head. There is the body of a feather serpent that comes out of the mouth of that monstrous head that represents a mountain. And when you visit the site, I'll give you a longer explanation. I just want to show you a few things to just to highlight how beautiful this is and how richly decorated. The face has been damaged. That was not by accident. It's really the only place in the carving that was damaged, so it was probably done on purpose. Here are some of the other figures that decorate. There's a whole history in terms of that has been told by these figures. It's actually an image of the king rising from his burial as the sun god, and is accompanied by these gods of the night sky, providing sustenance to him in the shape of the hieroglyph for tamales. Here's an image of the open mouth of a feather serpent. Here's the eyes of the serpent. Here's the fangs, as if it's about to bite something. It's actually exhaling, because the breath of feather serpents is the life substance of gods in Maya belief. Here's another one of these royal figures rising from the dead as sun gods. And here's the inscription, just briefly. We have the name of 5 kings in the dynasty, the 5 kings prior to AD 600. So see, these are the earlier kings. There were kings after this we don't know anything about. But we're able to not only read the names, but learn about their affiliation. This is the the last king in the list, is the son of the one who's being celebrated in the carving as the successor, and it was probably his father. And he tells us that he was a vassal of the Snake Kings, the famous kings of Calakmul and Sibanche, that by this time had pretty much defeated all the other kingdom and turned them into their subjects. So very important information about Maya history at this time. And here is the structure with the carving, and then amazing, another structure underneath. And in this red box was the tomb that we now identify as the tomb of the character depicted in the carving. And here's a snapshot of what that tomb looked like when we got in there after many weeks of excavation in these very small tunnels with very little air. And you can see how many pottery pieces were in there. Just one example of one of them. Here you have a depiction of the god of the underworld, the god of the dead, coming out of the shell. Looks like a marine shell or snail with a big lotus flower above it, the symbol of the underworld, the lotus flower. So very appropriate. And as I said, in this sequence of buildings, we found a throne room that may have been occupied by the very king that was buried underneath the throne and celebrated in the roof of the structure above it. And this is the burial of what we think might be the queen, his queen. So it's just remarkable that by having this long-term investigation, we were able to find very detailed historical information and identify the individuals physically. We have recovered the remains of the individuals mentioned in the local history. And we have found their jewelry. In this particular case, it's just a remarkable object because not only is beautiful, it's made of jade, but behind has a dedication. It doesn't have a name of a local king, but it has the name of the overlord from the Snake Kingdom, from the Kaanul kingdom. And so we can infer a lot of interaction between the small king going up to the capital of his overlord and receiving a gift like this one, that eventually will end up in his tomb. And we're finding it, 1,500 years later. Just remarkable. So just going quickly, moving to another pyramid and show you what we found there, very similar. This is about 600 years earlier, a temple known as Building B that has actually 4 temples underneath what you see on the surface. These are all built over time, one on top of the other. The first one has this amazing decoration. This is the area we cleared in the rubble that covered it, and is the tunnel that visitors can go in, a few at a time, to stand, up close and personal, and stare at the god of the underworld right into his eyes. Here's a profile of the monstrous depiction. This is the depiction basically of the god of the earth, in whose mouth is the old god, the god of the dead. And here you have crossbones and skulls, actually indicating this is the world of the dead. And here are a recent group of visitors, our VIP visitors. This is a picture of our camp, where we might be able to do clamping if we want. Here's a landing pad for helicopters. It looks very small when you fly over it. In fact, many pilots have missed it in the past, in the first few flights. But when you actually land on it, it's pretty big, and you can fit actually 3 helicopters parked at a time. Just wanted to make that point. Here, some of the vehicles are owned by local members of the community that are now gearing up for tourism, which is still, in its incipient stage in terms of building up infrastructure. These are some of our VIP tourists going from the helicopter pad to our site, going through this cloud of butterflies on the muddy road. And here they are. So as you can see, it's a very limited space. You can see every detail of the carving, but we can't really have more than 4 or 5 people in there at the time. So, for a small group, that's not a problem. Now, moving on to the final part of my presentation, in answer to the question of what did LiDAR, this new technology, do for us, like the documentary said, it changed everything. And so it just, the most emblematic example is Tikal, which you see here at the center of the map. In the white, in the red box, you have the map that we had before LiDAR, done by University of Pennsylvania over many years in the 60s, at 16 square kilometers. And pretty much we thought that was the center of Tikal. But now we have about 100 square kilometers around it, and there appears to be no end in sight for the urban sprawl that surrounded this central part of the city. And we're hoping to get more LiDAR to see the rest of it here to the south and the west, because the projections are that it's going to keep going. And so this might be the largest Maya city after all. Another quick look at what it did specifically in my area, what LiDAR did for me in my research. In white, you see all the structures that I was able to map in 20 years of 15 rather, 20 years of very arduous cutting through the jungle on foot to locate structures and pyramids and large and small. And this is what the LiDAR did in 2 weeks. In fact, in this area, they may have just spent 2 days flying over it. And we went from 1,000 structures to 5,000 structures. And that was just the beginning, because then we realized that all these areas that were wetlands, we thought could be unusable for the Maya because they flood periodically, were actually turned into some of the most productive by building drainage channels that would regulate the flow of water to make them into well-irrigated fields. In addition to that, we had defensive works on many hilltops. It looks like the entire valley was fortified. Anyway, thank you so much for allowing me to share my experience. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to open it up for questions. I've got a few already for Francisco. This is that picture from the top of Temple 216 at Yaksha, where you can have sundowners, Guatemala style, overlooking the Yaksha Lagoon and the jungle as it comes to life. I thought this was kind of a nice calming picture for all of us to end on in these turbulent times, just to put ourselves in this place that is a really peaceful, incredible place to spend an hour or so watching the sunset. So go ahead, and if you have questions for Jimmy or I, or for Francisco, pop them into the Q&A or the chat panel. And I'll kick it off, Francisco, with a question. You had talked about Tikal and how much bigger the number of structures and the suburban sprawl, if you will. Do you guys have an estimate now of the size or the number of the population of Tikal, and has that changed thanks to LiDAR?
Yes, but it's still preliminary because, as I said, we expect that number is going to increase when we get more LiDAR to the south and the east. So we think there might be a lot more people settling. But so right now, our estimates, actually, in terms of the population that we were able to measure right now, we're about 100,000. Which is not much more than some of the more optimistic estimates for Tikal before LiDAR. Again, that's because Tikal was one of the most studied Maya cities in Maya archaeology, so a lot of people put some time into really estimating the population size there, even though we had very limited data. And so, but the range started at about 50,000. To 100,000, and now with LiDAR we think it's much closer to 100,000. in the area that we mapped. And of course, we don't know how many more might be living outside of the area.
So that's just the area you showed the picture of, but there's all that other parts of that have yet to be mapped by LiDAR that could have a lot more structures and therefore more people.
I know my colleagues are probably going to roll their eyes when I say this, but you know, I wouldn't be surprised if it would be double that when we finish with the LiDAR.
Wow. Jimmy, you have a question here from Andres. Do you want to?
I got a question here from Andres, my good buddy from Mountain Lodges of Peru. His passion on ancient civilizations, and we did a trekking adventure when we were in Barrichara last year, and that's all we talked about was ancient civilizations. So he was very excited for the presentation, and he's asking Francisco if you're using GPRS technology to find underground structures once in the field.
Yes and no. So I know about that technology, and I haven't been able to use it, but some of my colleagues have. And one of the problems with that technology is that in a jungle environment where there are so many roots everywhere, you know, big trees growing everywhere, it's difficult to operate that equipment. My experience is that you need a very even surface to roll that equipment, or at least the antenna, on the ground so that it can send a signal underground and map out what's there. But when you're trying to climb a pyramid that is basically a pile of loose rocks with roots and things with thorns and all that, you can't cut that down. It tends to be difficult. But some people try it, at least in the plazas, where they're able to clear enough of an area, and they have mixed results because the limestone environment also doesn't lend itself well to this electromagnetic signal. So I think people are still experimenting.
Interesting.
Awesome, thank you, Francisco. And then we have Colin, my great buddy. I don't know if you're in Europe or in Canada. I don't know where you are, Colin, right now, but my regards to you.
Good to see your name, Colin. Good to see your name, our friend. It's been a while.
Okay. So he goes, great webinar, thank you. I have a question about future excavation programs. Now that the LiDAR has revealed stuff that might keep you busy for the next 100 years.
And
So
that's the quote.
So Francisco, is there plans to do another LiDAR survey in the works?
Yes. Well, as a matter of fact, I hope we only do LiDAR surveys from now on, because there's really no point in exploring the Maya lowlands without having the benefit of already knowing what's going to be there when you get out the door.
Right.
Yeah.
When you get out the car and start hiking, it's always nice to already know where you're going. And this is something that we could not have before. And so I would encourage my colleagues not to waste their time going out there without LiDAR on their tablet.
That's so cool. I mean, yeah, it'd be like hiking without a map, I guess, in the thick jungle on top of it.
Yeah, we've done enough of that.
Yeah, right. Well, you spent about 20 plus years doing that, so this has got to be a whole new world.
Yeah, entire lives has been spent doing that, you know, just hiking in the jungle, basically without knowing whether you're going to find something or not.
You're going to stumble across, yeah. How did that actually brings up a question? How did you end up at Homul and start the majority of your career spent at Homul? I know you've done a lot of other stuff too, but what brought you to Homul of all places?
It was a funny story because I was a student in a project in Belize, and my professor later became my mentor, is English. And he always wanted to work at a site in Guatemala, but because England and Guatemala were at odds over, you know, the Belize, British Honduras, the whole affair, he basically said, look, there's this site that I always wanted to work at, but, you know, they never let me because I'm English. But you're Guatemalan, they'll let you. And so he basically told me to get off the truck one day and just start hiking, and and then he would pick me up 3 days later while he was taking the students to Tikal. And so I had to find a way into Homul, and I didn't have any money, and so it was an adventure.
Wow.
That's real adventure travel in those
Yeah, it was
days.
an adventure. I found it, and then I was overwhelmed by the size of the pyramids, and so I decided I better not do that as a student, but get my degree first and then go back, and that's what I did.
You mentioned in your presentation about how LiDAR has exposed this, that the size of Homul is much larger, and that architect's rendering with all the trees around it was probably inaccurate, and then that most of that area would have been deforested and filled with homes. I know this is one of the big questions, but is deforestation increasingly becoming one of the reasons people think there was a decline of the civilization, or at least of some of these city-states, because of that?
Yes. So one of the theories of the so-called collapse is that the Maya degraded their environment by deforesting it and by causing erosion. But now we're finding that they had deforested their environment a long time before, for at least 1,000 years before the end of the classic period. And so we knew this, and so, but we didn't know how they managed their environment to make it last for at least 1,000 years that way. And so now with the LiDAR, we can see all these what we call land desk investments. So investment in terracing and walls and dams and irrigation system that not only increase productivity, but also prevent erosion and soil degradation. That's how they did it.
Huh.
And so that theory about the Maya degrading their environment is no longer viable, at least in my opinion.
Interesting.
We have to rethink everything.
Yeah, it sounds like that. Again, LiDAR has, as you said, I think in the video, that LiDAR's changed everything. Last question for me, and then if anybody else has any final questions, or Jimmy, please enter them now. If not, we'll wrap it up. But the frieze that you found inside of Homul, is that not one of the largest, if not the largest, intact Mayan frieze ever found in the Mundo Maya?
I'm not sure about the largest. It might be one of the largest, but as certainly one of the better preserved. Not only in terms of the carving being all there, but the pigmentation, the coloring that the Maya applied is mostly red, as you can see, and but it's also got some details in yellow and green and blue. I have never seen that before anywhere else.
And yeah, Jimmy. Well, I guess finish up, Jimmy. Just tell us again, being there, standing in front of that carving.
See, when I saw the pictures before, and Francisco always told me about the colors and everything, but once we got there and saw the coloring, that's crazy amazing. And then the way that he explained when they found it, that a couple years later, I think it was 2 years later, they started digging down below, and that's when they found that the carvings down below that had kind of like the history that was that had. So every day they're there, they just keep finding and finding and finding, and and just being there watching it, it's amazing. And like Francisco said as well, we if we can set up a camp and do an overnight in Homul, we've never done it before, but I know anything can be done, and with Francisco as well, we can set that up.
That actually brings up one last question for you, Jimmy and Francisco. What is the best time of year or the season where these types of visits out to Homul are possible or recommended?
Ooh, I'll leave that one to Francisco. He's been in the jungle more than I have.
Well, anytime really. The road, again, it doesn't. It's really not a very good road any time of the year. So it just goes from bad to worse, and that's why we recommend the helicopter. And so the helicopter can fly almost year round, and it's just a matter of, there is a big tropical storm, and that typically, in I think the worst rains are in September. And so bar that, I think every month of the year, you can have enough of a break in the weather that you can fly the helicopter on most days.
Yeah.
And
the time, just sorry, Ted, the time we did it last year we did it in February, I remember. February is pretty much our dry season, but up in the jungle, it rains anytime. And I remember when we were flying back, we had to fly around a small storm so we could get back in the Flores. But that's why it's anytime, pretty much anytime.
You're making me more jealous, Jimmy.
Many years ago, you could only get to Tikal by flying into Tikal on a passenger plane, on one of those DC-30, or I'm not sure.
It was a small Cessnas.
The Cessna.
Yeah.
And so since the 80s, that hasn't been possible. But now you can fly into these sites around Tikal and experience that amazing feeling that you're about to land somewhere in the small spot in the middle of the jungle, and there's going to be ruins right there. I find that fascinating.
That's so cool.
Okay.
And in a typical year, Francisco, what months are you down in Guatemala and out at Homul, or does it depend?
Typically, I'm there in the summer.
Got it.
Except for this year.
Yeah. Well, hopefully next summer you'll be back, or maybe even before. Fingers crossed that we start to see some things begin to open up. And that's another webinar, Jimmy, for later to talk about this current situation in Guatemala. But we're all hoping that we'll be able to get back to this business of travel soon. But
yeah,
we're going to wrap it up. And thank you so much, Francisco, for joining us and educating us. It's just inspirational and exciting. I've got a perma smile on for the rest of the day, so thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And Jimmy,
it was such a treat for everyone, and for us as well to have Francisco here live, guys. So thank you very much, Francisco.
And Jimmy, you're not going to Homul again without me.
Okay.
No, not again. If you have more questions, feel free to to email us. We may have a last minute one here. Great
Peggy says me too.
And we'll send out a recording if you missed any of it. We'll also send some links to some really interesting articles about Homul and about LiDAR, as well as a link to the video that we showed earlier if you want to watch in its entirety. So take care, everyone. Be safe. Stay healthy. Francisco, hope to see you soon. Jimmy, hope to see you soon. And thanks to everybody for joining us.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great time. Bye-bye.